It is inevitable that churches become part of a totalitarian society, therefore obedience to a church here and now equals damnation. Bruce Charlton. If you consider the nature of the kind of totalitarian society we inhabit in the West, it can be seen that it is inevitable that churches, including Christian churches, will be parts of the system. This to the same extent that these churches exist in the public realm as legal/economic/financial/employing/educational etc. entities. The nature of a totalitarian society is that all significant social institutions are necessarily part of the system of surveillance and control, which means part of the totalitarian strategy. Thus, in a totalitarian society, insofar as they are significant social systems, churches will be part of the system, that is, part of the totalitarian system. And totalitarian equals evil. Therefore, under totalitarianism, in the West here and now, churches are evil institutions, evil in overall effect and by their overall aim. The consequence is that, as a strong generalization, obedience to churches equals obedience to evil. Which means a positive choice to reject the salvation of Jesus Christ, and instead to choose damnation. This is explainable on the basis that the totalitarianism is manifested materialism, and operates by brainwashing people, by multiple means, to regard the external and the material as primary, indeed as the only real, and to subordinate, ignore or deny the inner intuitive and the spiritual. Churches are readily encompassed into totalitarianism, insofar as they actually function on the basis of quasi-objective laws, rules, regulations, dogmas, written documents with fixed conceptual interpretations, on the one side, and requirements for particular publicly observable behaviors, speech, writing, actions on the other. Therefore, under totalitarianism, any church that operates on the basis of public obedience to publicly observable and regulate-able behaviors is doing the work of evil, doing evil in terms of training its members to regard the external and the material as primary and mandatory. What is deadly is the doctrine that salvation depends on the principle of obedience to a church which is so pernicious, rather than the specific content of that obedience. So, here and now, any church is evil in requiring obedience to itself, which is a social institution, as necessary to avoid damnation, when in reality this obedience is itself, precisely, damnation. It can be seen that under totalitarianism, the churches, which are part of the system, engage in the same institutionally imposed value inversion that characterize totalitarian evil. Totalitarianism is evil because it is a manifestation of that kind of materialist, anti-life, anti-human evil I have termed harmonic, therefore evil both by its demonic aim, and also intrinsically, by its nature. Note added, I realize that real Christians who are, here and now, members of churches do not obey them, except selectively, and on the basis of intuition and spiritual guidance, which is precisely not to obey, in a traditional sense. However, too many of these people are currently dishonest or self-blinded as to the foundational Christian necessity of their own and personal discernment, which is itself a weakness and or a sin, doubly so when they pretend to church obedience as necessary to salvation. It is therefore important that such people understand what they are actually already doing, and why, and are explicit and honest about what they are doing, at least in their own minds, if not publicly. As we may perceive all around us in everyday life, nobody can be argued or compelled to take personal responsibility for their own choices, nor can they be argued or compelled into becoming conscious of that which they prefer to maintain unconscious. And there is a significant chance that having bad faith pointed out will merely lead to an escalation of the self-distraction and displacement activity of attacking the messenger. It would therefore be much better if the kind of self-identified obedient church-first Christians I am talking about would reach a true recognition, each from and for himself. What to make of significant moments, peak experiences, epiphanies, revelations. Because they don't interpret themselves. Bruce Charlton. I have for decades had a strong interest in those moments of experienced numinous significance, those times and places where, either at the time, or in retrospect, we have a conviction that something has happened which is of relevance to our life, generally. It seems that many people have these peak experiences. They vary with age, circumstances, place and company. Some people have them a lot, and some, apparently, not at all. The actual raw experiences, their emotional and sensory qualities, seem pretty similar and identifiable as such. Yet whether they are significant, and, if so, what is their significance, seems to depend on the interpretative scheme that is applied, and a wide range of schemes are applied. I think it is not the intensity of emotion that matters, but the lingering sense of significance, the way an event recurs in memory, and that something important, and potentially good happened. But understanding what happened, and what are its meaning and implications, is where there are such big differences between people. I have read many books and essays by mystical spiritual esoteric occult type people, and it is evident that most of them have these peak experiences and regard them as central to whatever it is they believe. Yet that which they believe varies extremely widely and often in opposite directions. From atheism of an hedonic flavor, right through New Age spirituality to devout adherents of formal and traditional religions, of many kinds and with perhaps opposite tendencies. From this, it seems clear that such experiences are not evidence or proof of any particular system or metaphysical assumptions. This applies even when the experience is one of theophany, a vision of God, for example. Reading the reports from people who believe they have experienced the presence of God, it is clear that the believed experience alone does not really get them anywhere in the longer term, because they need to understand, explain, make sense of their experience, and that requires such larger, perhaps pre-existing, scheme of assumptions. There is therefore probably an excessive emphasis on the occurrence of mystical spiritual, etc., experiences, and a relative, or complete, neglect of the matter of making sense of such experiences. In other words, the significance of unitary, discrete experiences is not self-evident. The scheme by which one makes sense of peak experiences, and indeed of all kinds of life experiences, is a different matter, and apparently a deeper and more significant matter, than even the most significant of moments. Numinous experiences are objective, yet also personal. Bruce Charlton. From what I can gather, and assuming other people are telling the truth, what elicits numinous experiences varies between persons, and in this sense the numinous is subjective. Yet for each person there seems to be an objectivity, in that particular places and people can sometimes be, more or less, at least for a while, relied upon to evoke the numinous in a repeatable fashion. I am assuming, in all this, that one is, in the first place, open to the experience of the numinous, which, apparently, many people are not. The numinous sensation of some kind of underlying spiritual, religious or divine quality, needs to be distinguished from liking, enjoying, and finding immediately beautiful. I think this must be because the numinous is something implied or behind the surface of things. Thus, the numinous feeling seems more associated with yearning than with gratification. It has elements of deep and lasting fascination, such that the numinous stays in the mind and recurs, and each recollection brings the feeling again. Furthermore, I have found that, assuming a receptive mood, the numinous is experienced first time, rather than being a thing that develops with repetition. A recent example was driving along the B7009/709 beside Ettrick Water in the Scottish borders, the same trip in which I visited Tamlin's Well. This was only my second time along this road, and over 30 years apart, and it was again the quietest, most traffic-free, road I have ever encountered. I find the journey weaving beside the Ettrick water extremely numinous. The scenery is indeed somewhat conventionally attractive, yet far from the most attractive, even in the immediate vicinity. Indeed, there aren't many pictures of Ettrickdale online, nor has anybody made a photographic book of the region. But for me this landscape is saturated with covert meaning and significance. I experienced a like magical trance while in the area. When we passed the watershed of the Ettrick and crossed west into Eskdale, the numinous sensation began to diminish. The scenery was at least as pretty, indeed conventionally better, and yet for me the underlying magical quality reduced. I wonder if this has to do with a change of geography or geology, or some kind of memory or association. Who knows? But this is the way that such things seem to work. Another example is Oxford versus Cambridge. For me, at least until around the millennium, when it diminished quite sharply, a reduction in the spirit of the place. Oxford is a numinous place but Cambridge is not, indeed Cambridge is anti-numinous. Despite Cambridge being prettier and much less traffic ravaged. There are historical reasons why this might be so, for example Royalist Oxford versus Roundhead Cambridge, Classical Oxford v Mathematical Cambridge, and again the geography is different, albeit in this case I find the West more numinous than the East. Albeit rural East Anglia is numinous, as are Ely and Norwich. But in the end, the numinous is a matter of experience, yet any explanation of the difference comes second and is not necessarily convincing. Even locally, in my everyday life, I find some particular trees, buildings, streets numinous, but most others not. But why this should be, I cannot even guess. I have found the same, throughout my life, with people. A few people had, when I met them, a numinous quality, while others seemed and remained stubbornly unromantic. This applied to both men and women, friends and acquaintances. And, like places, the numinous romantic quality could be lost, but was never gained after an initial absence. And the numinous is attractive, but not necessarily conventionally beautiful or nice, or even necessarily likable, while, conversely, a person could be attractive and likable without having anything of the numinous about them. As I discussed earlier today, what this all means is a different matter from the fact of its reality. However, it is, and always has been, important to me. I will go to efforts and inconvenience to experience the numinous, and will continue to puzzle over its implications, without ever getting anywhere in particular. I am convinced that something is going on in me, at some level, in these numinous experiences, and that it is of lasting importance. And so long as I continue feel that, and am able to respond to places and people in this fashion, for so long will I continue to seek experience of the numinous. Welby watch no more. Bruce Charlton. I see that the egregious Justin Welby, surely the most completely mediocre and corrupt individual ever to hold the position so far, has been forced to resign as Archbishop of Canterbury, and this only 7.5 years after his complicity in systematic sexually abusive training camps was described in multiple and detailed reports in Anglican Ink dating back to early 2017, as well as the Daily Telegraph. Which means, as usual, the media reports are deeply misleading, since Welby's role in covering up abuse, as well as his active role as camp counselor, will have been thoroughly known to the monarch and Prime Minister for all this time, e.a. those responsible for appointing the Archbishop of C. They and other senior people have therefore been shielding and protecting Welby, and apparently maintaining him in his job for as long as they could, because he was doing their bidding, following their agenda, and doing what they regard as a good job, i.e. destroying the Church of England specifically, and attacking Christianity in general. Among Welby's multiple aggressions on Christianity, surely his greatest was during the Birdemic, when the Church of England imposed probably the most stringent lockdowns of any British institution. This succeeded in its implicit aim of wiping out approximately an extra quarter of church attendance, over and above the steady decline over which Welby has presided. Goodbye, and good riddance. Well, we shall see what happens next to the docile dope of Lambeth Palace, before deciding whether he has really been punished at all, or just translated to a higher sphere. Note, the position of Archbishop of Canterbury is not quite the joke job it superficially seems. As well as being the senior bishop of the worldwide Anglican Communion, which is the third largest Christian denomination, after the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, Cantor, the Latin abbreviation of Canterbury, is an integral part of the UK Constitution, second in precedence to the King, who appoints the Prime Minister, and required to anoint the legitimate monarch at his coronation. Political optimism is an Antichrist phenomenon. Bruce Charlton. Just a reminder, 8 years on, referencing the current environment of optimism among the self-styled based online, that we live in a totalitarian civilization, and that to desire for its revitalization by the results of an election is the kind of sin implied by the Antichrist phenomenon, to place one's hope in one who is not Christ, but in important and fundamental respects, this worldly net opposite of Christ. Recall too, that this worldly pessimism is not despair. Nor is optimism a Christian virtue, indeed, it may be an evil coping mechanism. With matters as we know they are in the West, we should hope for the best, because we do not know everything, yet our hope needs to be not of this world, but we should expect things to get worse, because that is where we are, and the trend for generations, with self-destruction baked in, and the worst is what Western people deeply and overwhelmingly want. Of which the QA non-silk was a prime instance, its mantra being that we ought to trust, I assume the positive inner motivations of a mainstream politician, and team, the plan, i.e. the system, i.e. external and human guidance, and do not take personal responsibility for your value discernment. Things are much worse than you think, progressing over more than 2 centuries, by now the rot goes very deep and very wide. Reset to an earlier phase is impossible, it has never happened, and it never will. How the Kalam cosmological argument fits my assumptions, kind of. Sort of. Premise 1. Francis Berger. Once again, for your reading pleasure, the illustrious Kalam cosmological argument. If you are wondering why I am expending my precious time on this rehashed argument, thank Krista of the Orthosphere, who insists that my assumptions pass the scythe of this argument, an argument promoted by contemporary Protestant system Christian who reformulated it from the work of medieval Muslim who, in turn, was inspired by the logical arguments of an ancient Greek pagan. That alone should make you pause for thought. Anyway, here is the Kalam cosmological argument again, not including premise 4 and conclusion 5. 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Let's focus on premise 1. What does everything encompass? No idea. It certainly cannot include God because that opposes Craig's assumptions and beliefs, and mine, albeit for different reasons. See the trick in the first premise. God never began to exist, but everything else did, hence God is the cause of everything. Quick question. Why doesn't the argument just stop there? Who needs the second premise and the conclusion? Occam's razor, man. Occam's razor. Next question. What does begins to exist mean? To come into being from nothing. Or pre-existing things / beings undergoing change and existing in another way or form. Craig implies the former, but the latter can also encompass begins to exist. For example, I didn't begin to exist in Hungary until I moved here a decade ago. Before that, I existed in another country. Final question. What does cause mean? I only ask because theologians and philosophers are known to be the most slippery and creative wordsmiths. Lawyers, eat your hearts out. Anyway, Craig is referring to Aristotle's efficient cause, the thing responsible for the motion or rest of the being in question. A carpenter is the efficient cause of a table. The material cause is the wood the carpenter uses. The final cause is the table's end purpose. Ultimately, Craig implies that God is the initial cause of everything in the universe. Okay, got it. Once again, are the second premise and conclusion even necessary? The first premise has covered all the bases. After all of that, I can only begin to make sense of the first premise if I reword it in the following manner. Every being that begins to exist in creation has a creator. Do with that what you will. I'll address the second premise soon. In the meantime, enjoy this engaging debate between William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro. The topic: Jesus. Yes. Ben Shapiro, arguing about Jesus with the author of the Kalam ontological argument. My goodness. What have I got myself into? Contacts seem to be the potential basis of experiential understanding, as well as participation in the world of spirit. Bruce Charlton. For the past couple of years I have been reading considerably about what Dion Fortune and Gareth Knight, and other ritual magicians of their kind, call contacts, or sometimes masters. The experiences of individual communication, or sharing of consciousness, with a spiritual being. The phenomenon seems various in its details, and may occur in a full trance, i.e. when the human becomes unconscious, and speaks or writes without awareness of what is being communicated. Or it may happen in more alert trance states, with awareness of what is going on. This is apparently broadly the same as channeling, i.e. what is channeled, is a contact. And contacts seem to underlie, and blend with by degrees, much commoner and more normal phenomena such as an intense fascination, empathy, communion with some not present personage, who might be alive or dead, real life or fictional. Contact may be sensory, in the form of spoken words or conversation, clairaudience of visual, clairvoyance perhaps of visions, symbols, written words, or non-sensory, as what I call direct knowing. What seems to be the essential common factor is experienced person-to-person, or person-to-being, contact. Having read quite widely on this subject, it has become clear that, contrary to common claims, and despite that contacts are often sought purposively as a path to knowledge and guidance, such contacts are not necessarily, indeed only seldom, the basis for accurate or valid information. This is obvious from the apparent wrongness of much specific, and indeed abstract and generalized, information of this kind, but it must be true from the wide range of contradictory information cited between different, but apparently honest and competent, people, and the same person at different times. So I have concluded that contacts ought not to be regarded as a pathway to factual or conceptual knowledge or true guidance. On the other hand, I have concluded that experience of contacts are not only of potentially primary personal significance, but are probably necessary to the development of true knowledge. In other words, unless we experience a phenomenon that could be characterized as a contact, we shall never really understand anything. I concluded this from examining my own work in science and literature, as well as theology, philosophy, and mystical religious experience. Even from when I was an atheist, from more than a decade before I was a theist, or a Christian, I never really understood the meanings of things until I had had this kind of contact experience. For instance, if I was working on theoretical science, it was all just a matter of comparing models, an activity that had no end, and brought no sense of validity, until I had reached an empathic contact with those scientists, living or dead, whose work I was critiquing or using, and the same applied when I had developed a theory that I regarded as valid. Truth needed to be checked by a very inner process, much as I later called heart thinking, and until a proposition had passed this test I was never confident of it. True knowing needs to be known in the heart, and no amount of head knowing, logic and facts, can replace this requirement. Something closely analogous seems to be at work when I am trying to understand a writer. Unless and until I can attain an inward sense of contact and communion with that person, then I never really feel I know what they are saying. For instance, it took me about a decade before I got Owen Barfield, and felt that I really understood what he was thinking and asserting, and this understanding came as a consequence of getting onto his wavelength by a kind of sympathetic resonance, by thinking with him as I read his words or contemplated his writings. Much the same applied with William Arkell. I had to immerse into his writings for some years before, quite suddenly, I contacted his spirit and had the basis for understanding. But with other authors, such as S.D. Coleridge, I have never attained this sense of contact, therefore I have never, so far, been confident of understanding him. It is all second-hand, hearsay, models of what he was doing. It is certainly not the case that contact leads to correct understanding. Contact with Barfield and Arkell was just the basis for understanding them. I needed to study, read, reread, and think hard. So having experienced contact should not be used as a proof that one's understanding is correct. But without that contact, there never would have been genuine understanding. Furthermore, once one has attained contact, and followed it with serious study, one can recognize when others have not attained contact, and are merely parroting and playing with second-hand summaries and models. Contact therefore seems to be necessary but not sufficient to knowing. Contact is also perhaps one of the commonest and most readily available modes of direct spiritual experience, a kind of evidence of the reality of the spirit world. And this is just how things would be expected, in an animated, living reality, in this created universe ultimately composed of beings in relationships. In sum, I conclude that in ways that contacts are usually regarded, seem to be mistaken. It is usually an error to seek contacts as a source of factual information. However, contacts, properly regarded, can be an experience of the living world of spirits, an active participation, a world of conscious beings, recognition of a relational world, in which we are never alone. And a way of inhabiting a world where we can truly understand purposes and meanings, at least to the extent of our individual cognitive capacities, biases, defects and particular perspectives. All this depends on our regarding it as metaphysically possible, that is, our fundamental assumptions need to allow for such potential. We need to realize that this fits how reality is structured and operates. Habits and love, in relation to Christian life and the churches. Bruce Charlton. We cannot develop a habit of following Jesus, any more than I could develop a habit of loving my wife/kids/siblings. Insofar as it is a habit, it isn't love. This is because the best analogy/metaphor for the Christian life, the best, because literally true, is that of family and love. Family and love are primary, anything else, including habit, is secondary. Habit is indeed an aspect of system, and there are various aspects of system when it comes to family. One habit is rituals. The relevant analogy here is with church rituals, gathering, prayer, sacraments, etc. Ritual can certainly have a valuable role in sustaining family love. For example, taking meals together, going for walks, family holidays, and celebrating festivals such as Christmas. Such habits can be helpful in service to family love. But these rituals are just a potential basis for love. Each particular ritual is inessential, and can indeed be counterproductive. Thus, it is vital to subordinate the ritual to the love. Ritual must serve love. So that Christmas rituals, cards, presents, the meal etc., must not, as happens all too often, become so complicated, rigorous, effortful, that they lead to argument, accusations, resentment. The ritual has become counterproductive. The attempt to develop a habit of family love has led to its erosion. This happens with churches, and indeed with any kind of organization that uses system to pursue higher goals. For instance, when the correct conduct of ritual becomes the primary mode of evaluation of the higher goal, pursuit of that higher goal becomes impaired and may be prevented. As when the objective behavior of a church ritual dominates Christian evaluations, meanwhile Christian motivation, being subjective, hidden, is in practice ignored, or mere lip service paid. To clarify the metaphor, ritual is an aspect of system, and churches develop systems that are intended, initially, to serve and sustain the Christian life of love, the aim of following Jesus Christ to resurrected eternal heavenly life. Church systems then try to develop good habits, but the tendency is for habits to become primary, and this usually whether their in practice effect on love is helpful, or an obstacle, much like those overcomplicated and intrusive arrangements on Christmas Day actually lead to the opposite of what is hoped for and intended. The fact is that habits in particular, and system in general, are just means to an end, and that end must come first. And unless the end of Christian life is made explicit and distinguished from the habit/system, then it will get squeezed out, and Christian churches will have, mostly, already become, hostile to Christianity. In metaphysics, bizarre does not mean impossible. Final thoughts on the Kalam cosmological argument. Francis Berger. Note, this is my final post on the Kalam cosmological argument and other laws aimed at discrediting and disparaging my assumptions. Krista has responded to one of my posts about the Kalam cosmological argument. In his response, he insists that I am honestly mistaken about Kalam cosmological argument and classical theism and that pretty much everything I have said about them is false. I beg to differ, but I won't dedicate a post to quibbling. What I will do instead is address the battering ram Krista considers to be ironclad in his argumentation. The one he has consistently employed against my assumptions, the one he believes sinks my assumptions entirely, the apparent impossibility of traversing the infinite. Krista explained his position quite clearly in a comment on this blog.
Kalam demonstrates that perpetuity, of God, or of other beings, is an incoherent notion. There is no way an infinite temporal series of finite events, in the life of a cosmos or of a being, that had no beginning, i.e., a perpetuity, could ever reach the present moment, or any other. From a point in time infinitely far in the past of any moment, any now, an infinite series of finite events would have to traverse infinitely many finite steps to reach that now. And no number of finite steps can sum to infinity. From the perspective of any such now, the series would always be cooking along infinitely far in its past. Zeno's paradoxes of motion anticipate Kalam. For finite events in the foregoing we may substitute finite causes and reach the same result. No assemblage of finities can add up to infinity. It cannot be the case that its turtles all the way down. So, the real world and its panoply of causes must be finite. They must each have a terminus a quo, a first cause, an absolute beginning. Thus, perpetuity can't be carried into actuality. So, neither God nor any world can be perpetual. The necessity of an absolute beginning is by the way the basis and reason of creatio ex nihilo. The alternative, creatio ex materia, implicitly presupposes the actuality of an impossible perpetuity.
In his most recent post, Krista maintains his death grip on this position by doubling down via an external source.
An infinite collection formed by successive addition is impossible. Next, Craig argues that, even if an actual infinite is possible, An actual infinite can never be formed by successive addition. But, if the past is infinite, that is exactly what the past must be. Craig argues that, if the past were infinite, then an infinite number of successive moments have been traversed, i.e., an infinite number of moments have streamed by, so to speak. But, if traversing the infinite were possible, it would lead to a number of absurdities. To illustrate this, he uses the example of the infinite counter. Imagine that there has always been the count from Sesame Street. He has always existed, and as long as he has existed, he has been counting down. Today, he is about to reach 0. -2. He says. -1. 0. Now, it seems clear that, if I begin counting up, 1, 2, 3, I will never reach infinity. One can never count to infinity. But, why should it be any different in the other direction? How could one ever count from infinity? In this example, it seems like the count would reach 0 today, because, if the past is beginningless, there were an infinite number of moments before today. But, wait. There were also an infinite number of moments before yesterday. So, it seems like the count should have finished counting yesterday. But, wait. There were also an infinite number of moments before a year ago, or a billion years ago. In fact, no matter how far back in time we go, it seems like the count should have always already finished counting, since, no matter how far back in time we go, there was always an infinite amount of time before that. But, that is absurd. Therefore, an infinite succession cannot be traversed.
I could counter Christa's selective or limited understanding of infinity in my own words, but I don't think that would make much of an impression on or difference to Christa. So, what I will do instead is refer to Edward Fesser, a prominent philosopher firmly within Christa's classical theist camp, who offered the following concerning the Kalam cosmological argument, infinity, and Craig's notion of time.
A third reservation, the one I will discuss here, has to do with the question of whether one really can demonstrate that an infinitely old universe is metaphysically impossible, and in particular whether one can demonstrate that an accidentally ordered series of causes, as opposed to an essentially ordered series, cannot be infinite. This is, of course, the traditional bone of contention for Thomists. I am not convinced that this cannot be demonstrated. But I'm not sure that Craig's metaphysical arguments for that conclusion, for example the well-known appeals to Hilbert's Hotel and similar examples, work. Recall that the basic Kalam argument says 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. So the universe has a cause. That's the easy part, and the main work in defending the argument involves A. Defending the second premise, and B. Showing that the cause of the universe must be a divine cause. It is in defending the second premise that Craig appeals to examples like Hilbert's Hotel. The basic idea of such arguments is this. We can draw a distinction between an actual infinite and a merely potential infinite. A potential infinite is a collection that is actually only finitely large, but can be added to without limit. For example, suppose there are 10 chairs in some particular room. We could always add an 11th, a 12th, and so on, and, if we knock out some of the walls and expand the room, can in principle add any number of further chairs ad infinitum. A potential infinite never is actually infinitely large, but can still always be added to in theory, as long as time and resources permit. An actual infinite, by contrast, already is infinitely large. An actually infinite collection of chairs, for example, would be one that already includes an infinite number of chairs, all at once and at the same time. This is a distinction Craig borrows from Aristotle, even if in other respects his argument is not particularly Aristotelian. The use he makes of it is this. The notion of a potential infinite is unproblematic, but the notion of an actual infinite is fraught with paradox. For instance, if we imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms and an infinite number of guests checking in and checking out, we will, if we work out the implications, find them to be utterly bizarre. So bizarre, in Craig's view, that we should conclude that such a hotel could not possibly exist in reality. Those familiar with Craig's argument will know how the details of examples like these go. I won't rehearse them here, and this shows, Craig argues, that the idea of an actual infinite is in general very fishy. There just can't be an actually infinite collection of things. Now, an infinitely old universe would constitute an actual infinite, Craig argues. It would amount to an actually infinitely large collection of hours, days, years, or whatever other unit of time you pick. Hence, since there cannot be an actual infinite of any sort, there cannot be an actual infinite of this particular sort. So, the universe cannot be infinitely old. Now, one problem here is that it will not do to show merely that an actual infinite like the one described in the Hilbert's Hotel scenario is bizarre. To show that something is bizarre does not suffice to show that it is impossible. For that, you need to show that it involves some outright contradiction or incoherence. But perhaps that can indeed be shown. That isn't the issue I'm concerned with here. So, for present purposes, let's concede for the sake of argument that scenarios like Hilbert's Hotel really are strictly metaphysically impossible. The problem is this: how does this show that an infinitely old universe is impossible? In particular, how does this show that there could not have been in the past an infinite series of hours, days, or years? The reason this is a problem is that Craig is a presentist. That is to say, he thinks that it is present things and events alone that exist. Past objects and events don't exist anymore, and future objects and events don't yet exist. This contrasts with theories of time like the growing block theory, which holds that past and present things and events exist, with the present being the growing edge of a block universe, and with the eternalist view that all things and events, whether past, present, or future, all equally exist. Now, his commitment to presentism is not itself the problem. In fact, I agree with Craig about that. I will have much more to say about that subject in forthcoming work. The problem is rather this: if the present alone is real, then how can an infinite series of events in time count as an actual infinite? Past moments of time are not actual, they no longer exist. Hence, an infinite series of past moments is not relevantly analogous to Hilbert's Hotel. In the Hilbert's Hotel scenario, all of the hotel rooms in the infinite collection of rooms, all of the guests in the infinite collection of guests, etc. exist together all at once, at the same time. But, for a presentist, past moments, and past things and events in general, no longer exist. They don't exist together, all at once and at the same time, because they don't exist at all. Hence there really is even prima facie, again, if one is a presentist, no such thing as an infinite collection of past moments of time, as there might at least prima facie be an infinite collection of rooms and guests. So, an infinitely old universe scenario is simply not relevantly analogous to scenarios like Hilbert's Hotel, in which case, it seems Craig's argument will fail even if it is conceded that an actual infinite is impossible. For an infinitely old universe just wouldn't be an actual infinite in the relevant sense.
Krista can do with that what he will, but I think that pretty much sinks the "you can't traverse the infinite" mantra. So much for turtles all the way down. If it doesn't, I have a whole bag of other goodies that could do so in a far more devastating fashion. But here's the thing. I don't want to pursue this anymore because it is drawing me closer to philosophy than to God. What Krista and I have been engaged in since September only demonstrates the futility and limitations of pursuing Christianity via secondary thinking, communication through language and other symbols. We could literally keep this up to infinity and get nowhere with each other. I would much rather focus on expounding my assumptions and how these relate to my primary thinking and direct knowledge. I invite Krista to do the same. Leave the world of secondary thinking for a while and see what happens. Note added, the whole spiel about counting to infinity in the example Krista cites is hogwash. It is nothing more than a conflation of actual infinity and potential infinity. Infinity is not a number. It is a property of a number. Counting to infinity would be akin to counting to primeness or evenness. That actual infinities are logically and metaphysically possible has not been a controversial topic in mathematics for over a century, yet people like Craig and Krista still consider them to be killshots for metaphysical assumptions that do not complement theirs. What do the Kalam cosmological argument, the necessity of a first cause, and other philosophical arguments have to do with being a Christian or following Jesus? Well, for me, not much. But for guys like Krista, it seems to be all that matters. I'm sorry, Greg, I'm afraid I can't do that. The totalitarian Internet of Things here and now, and going ahead, regardless. Bruce Charlton. Greg is an engineer/pilot tech vlogger whose aircraft stuff is second to none. He also does things about cars, which I don't usually look at, but I took a look at this one, about a new Ford Mustang. Specifically, it is about the data that the car collects from the vehicle, the driver, and what the driver does in and with the vehicle, including reading and recording his mobile phone. This information is used to enforce certain styles and practices of driving. If certain things happen, the car will compel you to leave the road, stop, and switch off the engine. If the computer doesn't want you to do something, the car won't do it. The logged information is also shared with Ford, law enforcement, and anyone else that the company deems to be a responsible authority. Plus, conditions of use are explicitly changeable in an open-ended way, without obligation to inform the owner. Your car can, and, soon, presumably will, report you for what it regards as any kind of traffic, or other, offenses, and provides the authorities with the necessary objective information to prove your guilt. All of which you have agreed to in advance by consenting to the terms of service. Condemned by your own will. The demons insist on it. The whole video is relevant, but the main information comes from 440. This video made quite an impact on me, because it is representative of the top-down, totalitarian agenda of omni-surveillance and micro-control. It is not something that might happen. The Internet of Things is here and it is now. It is the society we live in, and, although nobody is asking for this stuff, people are nonetheless paying big money to purchase technology with these features. You can't get the latest tech without the totalitarian terms of service. And people really want the tech, or else get it forced upon them by regulations. As far as I can see, there is only one thing that stands between the West and a society of totalitarian harmonic evil, and that is societal collapse. In other words, so long as the system remains, it will be implementing omni-surveillance and total control, to the best of its ability. But that ability is declining, because the West has purposive self-destruction baked in, and will sooner or later collapse. Already the system cannot actually implement its own plans, as was evident through 2020. There are many factors that guarantee that soon the system will enter a positive feedback failure, when failure in subsystems will compound, accelerate, and the whole thing will implode, with or without external intervention on top of that. Also, because the system is destroying itself, the later the collapse happens, the more complete it will be. I find it chilling to recognize, yet again, that we are ruled by an obviously evil-serving ruling managerial class on the one side, who are determined to impose a materialist nightmare on the masses, and themselves, and with a short-termist, passively servile, novelty and convenience-addicted mass population on the other, who see no further than to get increments of status, comfort and fun. And that's it. Because the public morality of the West is a tissue of, thinly, disguised wickedness. And those who oppose the officially leftist litmus test ethic, are merely proposing a more efficiently hedonic system, a more nationally functional totalitarianism. As I said, it's a race between totalitarianism and collapse. Will the one happen before the other supervenes? Things are much worse than, almost, everybody thinks they are. What really dismays me is not so much that the die is cast, and there is nothing significant that you or I can materially do to stop and reverse this manic societal self-destructiveness. Because it is rooted in an overwhelming majority atheistic nihilism, is, therefore, ultimately desired. What dismays me is the attitude. The mixture of denial and indifference. The dumb farmyard ethic of thinking that prevails. The bland nice hand-wringing, the attempts to defeat totalitarianism by more regulation, more layers of bureaucracy. The grasping at straws of assuming somebody or another in the leadership class will save us from abuses, and that we can select these goodies through approved mechanisms such as voting, direct action, pressure groups, whatever. All this is avoiding the essential. Spiritually we can and must understand, make explicitly conscious, what is happening, and that it is evil, and instead of inviting evil into our hearts, inwardly reject, i.e. repent, the evil totalitarianism embodies. People must stop being stupid, lazy, and eagerly distracted. Everyone has the God-given capability to think sufficiently to choose salvation and reject damnation in whatever situation he finds himself, and everyone is responsible for his own thinking. Building imaginary castles in the air, from fake straws. Bruce Charlton. A while ago, I wrote a post about the determined optimists of the right, especially people who still, falsely, believe there is such a thing as the right, who busily build their optimism from fake straws they have clutched from the maelstrom of a collapsing civilization. Following the US election results, I can hardly believe the extent to which people are using fake straws to build grandiose but wholly imaginary castle in the air, that are supposed to represent their hopes of the kind of society that they want. Straw castles are bad enough, daydream castles are bad enough, but to daydream a castle made of fake straws. Well? Meanwhile, nothing has happened except words and emotions and speculations, and, by now, we ought to realize that, as of 2024, these do not amount to any good thing. Nothing is cheaper than words in the West, in 2024, being the most untruthful/anti-truthful society in the history of the world. It should, however, be remembered that thoughts are real, even air castles made of straw, but not necessarily real in the ways intended, and certainly not necessarily real in a good way. What is apparently real, is that, perhaps, surprisingly large numbers of those who purport to oppose the totalitarian leftist project, apparently believe, and are saying it, that decades of cumulative civilizational decline can be stopped and reversed by a mainstream election, leading to a new selection of mainstream political figures, being put in charge of an unchanged bureaucracy and media. They are saying that. Although maybe they don't really believe it. What is also apparently real, is the thoroughgoing mundane materialism of what such people want. They want so very, very little, just these politicians instead of those, these laws instead of those. Just common sense instead of institutionalized insanity. The fake straw optimists are therefore eminently reasonable, hence they cannot possibly succeed, because if almost everything stays the same, then we will have the same, or worse. They accept geopolitics, but want a different arrangement of nations and distribution of power. They want business as usual, but without the weird excesses of the post-millennial era. They want people to be sensible, and sensible in a normal, mainstream, hard-headed context. They merely want, in other words, a different flavor of leftism. And leftism is oppositional and necessarily destructive, because leftism is fundamentally atheistic and aspiritual. The art of the possible is in actuality asserting the impossible. It will never happen, it can never happen. It ignores and suppresses the need for motivation, and that motivation requires purpose, and that purpose requires the context of a purposive creation. And for creation to motivate us, requires that creation be of God, and for God to motivate us we must have a relationship with God. And for our relationship with God to have implications of truth, virtue and beauty, that relationship must be one of love. If we don't have that, we have no positive purpose, and insufficient motivation to do anything good. Which is exactly our situation. And election enthusiasm is not merely irrelevant, but actively and powerfully hostile to what is absolutely necessary. Note, there is a left, but no right, because leftism is oppositional to religion in general, Christianity in particular, and the spiritual and next worldly nature of Christianity, to be exact, Christianity, not churches, who are all of the left. The only valid options in the West are therefore various flavors of leftism, or Christianity. The Soul and the Earthly Self. William Wildblood. Please forgive me, but I am going to talk about myself. But then what else can we talk about? Isn't everything we perceive and experience filtered through the self? We can know nothing except through that self. So really every post of every blog is about the self of the writer. More, every book written, every painting painted, even every word spoken is about the self of the one through whom it comes. I have found in recent years that I am seeing myself more and more from the outside. I have always felt that the me I know here in this world is not the real me or only an aspect of the real me. It's a personality I am functioning through and by means of which I am experiencing the world, but it is not who I really am. Sometimes I have found that frustrating, sometimes encouraging. This doesn't mean I am not William Wildblood, but he is just my earthly persona, and behind that persona, which will die in the fullness of time, first the physical body and then its psychic elements, there is the soul, which is my spiritual self and a much more expansive being. Before I stand accused of monstrous spiritual egotism, I would say that is true for many people. Probably most, though possibly not all, as some humans are relatively unevolved as in undeveloped. Certain schools of thought have posited that some souls come down to earth as descending spiritual beings, seeking physical experience, whilst others rise up through the material world. These latter will have a spiritual core, but it waits to be developed by their actions in this world. This is why some groups of people are much more oriented to the physical side of things. Be that as it may, my experience as I grow older is that the center of my consciousness, while still firmly in the worldly persona, has started to move out of that and occasionally look at it from outside. I am no longer particularly attached to the desires and opinions of that person. He is me and I am him, but there is also a sense that there is something more going on, and I am not as identified with him as I was. There's no need to call in the men in white coats, as this is not some kind of psychological breakdown, and I am not becoming two people, but the sense of self is detaching somewhat from the local manifestation of it. It has not transferred elsewhere, and this is only an early stage in the process, but I suspect it is what happens to all of us when we die. Then we disengage from the earthly self and start to become that higher self. Those who fail to do this would remain what we call earthbound. Some will do this faster than others, but in the end all of us have to cast off the coats, that's to say the psychic and mental bodies, as they are called in some schools, that we have donned in order to function in the physical world. Incidentally, it is these cast-off bodies which still have some residual life in for a while that are probably what is contacted by spiritualists. Hence, the banality of most of what they have to say. I recognize I have a long way to go in the process, but I think that those of us who have some slight understanding of the spiritual world, and no one has more than a slight understanding, in my case it's more of a belief in than an understanding of, can do some of our dying before we die. I don't expect to die anytime soon, but a friend of mine died recently and he was relatively young, so death has been in my thoughts of late. The death of the body is just the first stage. We must disengage from the other vessels of the earthly self before we can return completely to the spiritual world. We can begin that operation while still alive by seeking to center ourselves in God rather than our worldly ego, and this has both a positive and negative component to it. The negative is detaching ourselves from our personal aims and ambitions, worldly wants, etc., chopping away. The positive, which is more important and if done properly will take care of the negative side by itself, is lifting the mind away from self and up to God. This will pull you up towards your own soul, which is where the life of God intersects with your own life. You will start to become your true self. Creation began, the beings in creation did not. Francis Berger. Assumption. Creation has a beginning, and it may have an end. The beings in creation, however, have no beginning and will have no end. They did not begin with creation, nor will they end with creation. Because creation has a beginning does not imply that creation is the only or ultimate beginning. The beings in creation pre-existed creation, therefore, before creation is conceivable. Nostalgia ain't what it used to be, Past Times 1986 to 2012, or, The Ebbing of the Intellectual Soul. Bruce Charlton. The UK retail company, shops, and later a mail-order website, called Past Times, was very much a phenomenon in the 1990s and early 2000s. It was a kind of gift shop that specialized in nostalgia, and it did a pretty good job of both fueling and supplying it, with modestly priced reprints and facsimiles of old books, pictures and prints, replicas of old toys, artifacts, jewelry and the like. Around the millennium it was a prime browsing place to get presents, including for oneself, and seemed like a permanent fixture in the high-rent zones of the city high street. Yet in 2012 Past Times went bust and was wound up altogether the year later. What's more, it was not replaced. Nostalgia stores became a thing of the past. As always, there are multiple potential explanations, but my spiritual interpretation is that Past Times was the last gasp of original participation, of the ancient and early childhood experience of spontaneous immersion in the world, of belonging, which has gradually dwindled down almost to nothing through the centuries, and especially in the modern era. In its commercial way, the shop was providing a secular equivalent of the robes, rituals, music and poetic words of the churches, providing a kind of system of symbols, via which individuals could relate to reality, as had happened so effectively at the peak of the Middle Ages. This medieval consciousness is termed the intellectual soul, and it worked by the individual learning, or being socialized into, and then assimilating, the correspondences of a symbol system to particular aspects of the spiritual life. After which, the symbol will reliably, and powerfully, trigger the appropriate spiritual response. Well, nostalgia systems, such as that provided by Past Times, did something analogous with the childhood memories of an earlier, and childhood, world where life had automatic purpose and meaning, where there was an almost unconscious sense of security and stability. Nostalgia continued to be effective for a while after the effectiveness of religious symbol systems had become a tiny minority phenomenon, on the basis of common childhood experience having changed less, and more slowly, than the adult world. But childhood changed, people changed, consciousness changed, and nostalgia lost its instant magic. Also, the establishment stepped up its subversion and suppression of nostalgia, to the point that now the past is assumed to be evil. In the mass media and among the ubiquitous bureaucracies of this era, the past is at best apologized for example those disclaimers before broadcasting old films, about the attitudes they embody being worn now, and wrong then. In the mainstream, the past is edited, invented, and rewritten for modern sensibilities. And increasingly the past is hidden and destroyed. Symbol systems are weaker, little wanted, and are disappearing, everywhere you look, in religion, and in the social institutions generally. The medieval type intellectual soul consciousness is almost extinct in the West, we are all alienated now. The Past Times era was therefore a particular phase in the development of human consciousness, and of Western secular materialism, the final ebbing of the medieval mindset. It could not last, and it did not last, and enjoyment of Past Times has now become a secret and guilty niche pleasure, or a defiant act of socio-political resistance. Note added, lest I be misunderstood, I am not saying that the intellectual soul is utterly obsolete, nor that symbol systems ought to be eschewed, but instead that we cannot, therefore should not, expect too much from them. Symbol systems are much weaker than in the past, and also modern man is far more aware that the medieval consciousness was always a compromise, a halfway house and transitional, and entailing considerable residual alienation. It is unideal, after all, for men to relate to ultimate realities only and always via intermediaries. and especially when the intermediate symbol system is regarded as the sole and mandatory way to relate to ultimate reality, as with medieval churches. This never was true, although it was a good approximation in some times and places. But now, it is clearly false, and assertions to the contrary are incoherent and, ultimately, made in bad faith. In sum, I see intellectual soul symbol systems of various kinds as retaining a potentially helpful role in the Christian life. Few can dispense with them, and certainly I can't. But going back to medieval consciousness cannot be the way forward from here, any more than the 60s countercultural attempt to return to the UN conscious, spontaneous and immersive spirituality, original participation, of tribal hunter-gatherers. Infinity, no beginning means no beginning. Francis Berger. Ask some classical theists what God did before creation, and they will protest that you cannot take such liberties and argue from the absurdities that result from such a line of thinking. Yet the same classical theists consider it perfectly acceptable to challenge assumptions about the infinite existence of beings by demanding those holding such assumptions explain how an infinitely old being could finish counting from negative infinity to zero and traverse the infinite lapse of time between infinity BC and the present. William James Tykonevich explains the problem and muddled thinking inherent in such demands. 1. Infinite elapsed time. As discussed in my earlier post, the Kalam cosmological argument assumes that there can be only two kinds of beings: 1, beings that began to exist a finite amount of time ago, and 2, beings that are atemporal, or exist outside of time. Everything we know, including the physical universe itself, belongs to the first category. It is therefore necessary to explain their existence by positing a being of the second type, and this is Allah. The reason given for rejecting a third category, beings that are temporal but never began to exist, is that for those beings an infinite amount of time must already have elapsed. They must already be infinity years old. However, it is impossible for anything to ever be infinity years old, because time elapses finite step by finite step, and infinity can never be reached by adding up finite quantities. With the caveat that it is notoriously difficult to think clearly about infinity, I think this argument is in error. It conflates never began with began an infinitely long time ago. Consider by way of analogy the number line of integers. It is infinite, but it would be sloppy thinking to say it extends from negative infinity, through zero, to positive infinity. There is no such number as infinity, negative or positive, on the number line. Of all the infinitely many integers on the line, not a single one of them is infinitely distant from zero. The present moment corresponds to zero, the past to the negative integers, and the future to the positive ones. If I say that my existence, in one form or another, is infinite in both directions, in precisely the same way that the number line is infinite, does that make me infinity years old? No. The Kalam argument assumes that an infinite amount of time must have elapsed from the beginning to the present, missing the point that there was no beginning. 1 billion years ago, I existed, and 1 billion years have elapsed since then. 1 quadrillion years ago, I existed, and 1 quadrillion years have elapsed since then. The infinity lies in the fact that the statement will be true for absolutely any number I choose, no matter how astronomically large it may be, but every number, without exception, will be a finite distance from the present, and only a finite time will have elapsed since then. Just as you can get from any point on the infinite number line to any other by adding or subtracting a finite quantity, so any distance on the infinite timeline can be traversed without an infinite amount of time elapsing. So, I reject this argument against infinite temporal existence. End quote. As do I. Short summary, you can't count from a beginning that isn't there. Furthermore, the following does not constitute a meaningful rebuttal or counter-argument. If a being has existed for an infinite amount of time, then it existed an infinite amount of finite years ago, and from that moment it would have to traverse an infinite number of years to fail to reach the present moment, or any other moments in its past. Why is this a meaningless rebuttal? Because it tries to sneak that non-existent beginning into infinity again, despite William's coherent demonstration that the very concept of infinity precludes a beginning by definition. Note, the above ties in with my declared assumption from yesterday: the beings in creation have no beginning and will have no end. Put another way, the beingness of beings is eternal. Next, worldly, but not world-renouncing, not ascetic but loving, Christian life. Bruce Charlton. I think it is a mistake when Christians present the faith as ascetic, world-renouncing, world-rejecting, as if this mortal life was merely a matter of, whether patiently, or not, waiting for death and resurrection. This makes no sense to me, because if mortal life is about rejecting this world, then we would die as soon as possible, or indeed, not live mortally at all but would go straight to heaven. I think the error ultimately derives from double negative theology, of seeing life in this sinful world as a matter of avoiding as many sins as completely as possible. The modern world is more this worldly and materialistic than any society ever before, so the natural reaction is often to aspire to reject everything, all material things, all attachments. But that lands us in Buddhism or Hinduism, not Christianity. What about the example of Jesus' own life? Well, it depends on which source you regard as primary. If, like me, you regard the fourth Gospel John as broadly authoritative, then there is no sanction for asceticism, since Jesus is depicted as living very socially, even feasting, and having very personal and loving attachments to family and friends. In this, Jesus is contrasted with John the Baptist, who is depicted as much more of a world-renouncing ascetic. On the other hand, most people prefer to take the synoptic Gospels, especially Matthew and Luke, as their primary sources, and these describe Jesus retreating into the desert for 40 days and nights. Very ascetic. Either this actually happened as Matthew and Luke said, or it didn't, as positively implied and negatively omitted by John, who could hardly have chosen leave out such a major event. The truth is not complicated, it is simply that we are supposed neither to be worldly materialists nor unworldly hermits, both red herrings, a false dichotomy, but to love during mortal life. That seems pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Loving, not rejecting. And to love means to love persons, beings, the living world, which is why we remain alive in this mortal life, and why we are not supposed to be trying to make mortal life into a second-rate version of being dead already. To love is to love material things as well as spiritual things, except that there are no things, not really, creation is alive. Of course, love is a dynamic thing, and is two-way, which is why we never stop needing to learn about it. That is what we are supposed to be doing while we are alive, and we shouldn't be hankering after the next life when there is important work to be done in this life. But love is something we must do while living. Although love is the purpose, it is not a purpose that can be aimed at of itself. We must love while living, while doing all the material mortal things we need to do. Which, presumably, is why we are alive. Francis Berger promotes an insane anti-Christian, anti-human culture and cult of death. Francis Berger. After months of fruitless exchange that Krista of the Orthosphere triggered here, I finally asked him what his motivation for initiating the discussion had been. Krista, what was your motivation behind initiating this whole fruitless, months-long exchange via comments on my blog back in September? I only asked because I wasn't the one looking for a discussion. You were? Here is Krista's response.
I sympathize with your frustration. It sucks for you that there is an intractable problem with your idea of perpetuity. But it is what it is. Believe me, It's not that I've been stubbornly unwilling to entertain your arguments, on the contrary, I've confronted them all head on. It's the problem that is stubborn. And the Kalam problem is not alone, unfortunately. When we say there are many beings like God, all of whom are infinitely old and will live forever, we dethrone him, and we contradict Scripture, massively, but that has so far proven no impediment. If he is of the same sort as we, or as Satan, then his will is no better than ours, or Satan's. We might as well disobey him, then, if that's what we feel like doing. After all, he is not the boss of us, so who is he to try to judge us? Who is he to establish a church, or before that a holy nation, and a royal priesthood? By what right does he expel Adam and Eve from the garden? Indeed, how could he even effect such an expulsion, or anything else, for that matter? Who is he to try to run a cosmic project? If God is in fact ultimate, it's foolish and deadly dangerous to disagree with him. If he's not, then, hey, all bets are off, as there are no odds maker, no contest to bet on, no field of contest, no rules, no judges or referees, no score. Then do as you wish is the whole of the law. I.e., there is no law. It's you against all others, and the will to power is all there is. Nietzsche was right. To hell with this idiotic cosmic project of YHWH. I've been motivated to engage with your arguments in the first place because I find such engagement edifying. I always learn a lot from such exchanges. I'm extraordinarily interested in them when they concern notions that if carried into practice could harm people. And the rejection of Christianity entailed by the idea that God is of the same sort as we would harm people a lot. As I wrote to you recently, it's no good to object that these recondite topics are merely a matter of private opinion, and so are no big deal, that, after all, readers are free to stay in church and chant their mistaken creeds if they like, the poor fools, deluded by false or pre-modern consciousness, and by them irrationally form their lives. Dawkins says the same, why then get all head up about them? Well, in the first place, by publishing them, you make them public, and in the second, it is a very big deal to vitiate the faith of the faithful, thus to promote their apostasy, whether or not intentionally, and so worsen their chances at everlasting life in heaven. It is like posting essays online that suggest fentanyl is cool. Moreover, as Dawkins has recently noticed, the abandonment of Christianity is not merely an inconsequential private matter. As apostasy propagates, it is disastrously vicious social and cultural sequelae. The post-Christian world looks categorically, profoundly worse than the pagan world that preceded it, for, paganism having been long already utterly moribund and incredible to moderns, it is not even the benefit of pagan morality. It is totally unmoored from morality, reason, truth, from reality, from life. I use the present tense because, despite the fact that a quarter of the world is still Christian, the character of the post-Christian culture bereft even of pagan cults is already horribly clear in peoples among whom apostasy has spread. When you derogate the church or her dogma, then whether you mean to do so or not, you promote that insane anti-Christian, anti-human culture and cult of death. Where Christ wanes, Moloch waxes. It's a deadly serious matter. It is serious as hell. That's why I take your arguments seriously, and try to refute them publicly, rather than wave them off as harmless idiosyncrasies.
Motivation is vital, but what is it? Bruce Charlton. I've been harping on about the vital importance of motivation since I began daily blogging in 2010, and repeating that this, our age is characterized by extremely, historically, low levels of motivation. So it's maybe about time I clarified what I mean, and what I do not mean, by motivation. Motivation needs to be distinguished from power. Indeed, motivation is revealed when power is lacking, when there are stresses and adversity working against it, and over the course of time. When weak motivations inevitably fail. Motivation is long-term, and continues despite lack of external encouragement or reward, and in the face of active discouragement and negative sanctions. Be clear that high motivation is not sufficient to good, it depends on what that motivation aims at, and someone might be highly motivated towards evil. However, motivation is necessary to good, because without motivation, people merely conform to external incentives and pressures. Therefore, motivation underpins long-term courage, and motivation is an aspect of freedom or agency. Motivation is inner, ultimately, therefore needs to be distinguished from what people actually do in their lives, because actions are subject to external control. In an extreme case, a slave's actions may be almost wholly controlled, on pain of death, yet that slave can be motivated to good. Or, more commonly, a person may be prevented from actioning his motivations by many adversities such as inborn deficits or damage, sickness or accident, or a character that is weak-willed. Because willpower is not motivation. Indeed, most people with exceptionally high levels of willpower, I have known several, use this to pursue socially valued behaviors. Their will is thus subject to somebody else's externally supplied motivation. Such a life strategy does not need real, i.e. inner, motivation. But a highly motivated person might be thwarted by his own deficiencies from achieving anything significant, or observable, and these deficiencies may include lack of willpower. Such an individual's aim is true, but his ability to action that aim is feeble. A highly motivated person is one who sticks to his inner goal, his destiny, as he has chosen it, even when he is unfitted, or for any reason unable, to achieve that destiny, even when he acknowledges that he has failed. High motivation is therefore indomitable, it cannot be beaten in this mortal life. And when motivation is aligned with God and divine creation, when motivation seeks salvation by following Jesus Christ, then we get the needful Christian combination. We get someone who will achieve resurrection to eternal life whatever happens or does not happen in the external world. And that is the vital importance of motivation. Note, the next question is perhaps, how then do I become a highly motivated, indomitable Christian? That is a task in its own right, and one that involves meeting one's own innate and most intuitive aims with a long-term and solid apprehension of the goodness and love of God the Creator. Second-hand information and advice do not suffice. External influences and pressures are more likely to be deceptive than helpful. It is a personal quest. But one who recognizes the absolute need for inner Christian motivation is guaranteed timely success, exactly because God is the Creator, is good, and loves us each individually. Christianity that lives by secondary thought. Francis Berger. Christianity that lives by secondary thought dies by secondary thought. Secondary thought refers to the process and state of being informed. In that sense, it is not a form of thinking or, at best, a low level of thinking. From the perspective of human consciousness, being informed involves receiving, interpreting, and internalizing external information via representational configurations, i.e., symbols, images, and language, and using these to augment or construct a sense of reality. Before the advent and eventual dominance of secondary thought, being informed meant something different. We can refer to this as primary thinking. Whereas secondary thought focuses on representations of reality, primary thinking is total or near total subjective immersion in reality. Immersion in reality is not limited to the simple act of confronting and contending with nature, it also encompasses a direct sense and knowing of the spiritual of which nature is but a subset. Because it does not rely on representations as a chief source of knowledge, primary thinking is a more concrete form of thinking, for lack of a better way of putting it. Secondary thought in the form of symbols, images, and language allowed men to overcome nature to a great degree. Still, this gradual mastery of nature weakened the concreteness of primary thinking. Consciousness became more attuned to the representational and abstract. It rescinded from thinking and settled into thought. Spiritually speaking, it would be wrong to consider this development in consciousness as negative because the shift toward the abstract allowed for the evolution of recorded knowledge, which led to increasingly complex societies and civilizations and better standards of living. People were increasingly liberated from the brute necessity nature imposed upon them with its redness in tooth and claw. Moreover, secondary thought allowed men to discover and contemplate the spiritual from new perspectives. However, learning new perspectives via the internalization of secondary, representational information continued to widen the chasm between man and his original mode of primary thinking. That basic yet virtually unfiltered direct knowledge of spirit was gradually replaced by the understanding of a physical world that was a subset of the spiritual world or utterly distinct from the physical world. The development of what we now regard as Christianity was a gradual process of converging upon, establishing, and, eventually, enforcing a mode of spiritual secondary thought. Vestiges of primary thinking were progressively filtered out, and eliminated in favor of a confluence of thought based on and rooted in secondary thinking, in the form of scripture, doctrines, rituals, symbols, etc. What we now regard as traditional or conventional Christianity amounts to little more than this convergence of secondary thought. The above-mentioned convergence of secondary thought solidified into spiritual authority, which merged with worldly power, a merger that eventually dominated and fueled civilization in the West. To put it in more contemporary terms, the convergence of secondary thought known as Christianity became the West's driving narrative, and it remained the West's driving narrative for as long as the authorities upholding the convergence formed and informed the narrative. The convergence of authority, however, proved unstable from the start. Although Catholicism enjoyed a millennium of virtual domination in the West, it had to do so within the framework of its eastern half breaking away via schism. Regardless, all Christianity, be it Catholic, Orthodox, or some splintered, minor faction, remained predominantly grounded in secondary thought and remained open to challenges emanating from secondary thinking. Information was probed and reinterpreted. Disagreements and disputes over the validity, soundness, interpretation, and enforceability of settled doctrines, texts, symbols, rituals, and so forth flared up throughout the history of Christianity, leading to reforms and further schisms of all sorts and varieties. In simpler terms, the narrative splintered but remained firmly entrenched in secondary thought, rendering it vulnerable to the continuing development of human consciousness, an increase in self-consciousness within the framework of secondary thought, which demanded an increase in the expression of individual liberty and agency, or, to put it another way, an increase in the personal ability to form, that is reform and inform, reality. I am inclined to believe this point in the development of human consciousness should have led to the broad recognition of the need to rediscover primary thinking and harmonize it with secondary thought, leading to an entirely new yet utterly innate form of thinking leading to full participation in, and with creation that lay dormant within human consciousness. The need was certainly recognized by some, and the expression of this recognition is what we now refer to as Romanticism. However, the Romantic upsurge ultimately failed because it did not adequately recognize or embrace latent spiritual possibilities. Christianity was oblivious to the upsurge altogether. The failure to harmonize and unify primary thinking and secondary thought solidified secondary thought at the expense of primary thinking. Since Christianity remained firmly committed to its truths in the realm of secondary thought, it could access no meaningful defense or counter to the secondary thought forces that increasingly questioned or challenged the truths churches, doctrines, and scripture expounded. As a result, Christianity fell upon its own sword. It ceded its secondary thought to the secondary thought narrative of science, logic, and reason, before submitting to and eventually merging with the secular narrative. People whose intuitions continued to sense the pressing need for the rediscovery of primal thinking and its harmonization with secondary thought of the need to personally form and reform the world from subjective, directly known spiritual acts and principles will be bereft of options at the collective level. The ruling secular narrative offered only secondary thought grounded exclusively in materialism, while the self-conquered religious narrative continued to promulgate an outmoded secondary thought narrative based on symbols and texts that no longer connected to anything beyond themselves. People are prisoners of secondary thought. Unfortunately, contemporary Christians rank among the most glaring examples of such prisoners. And that is where we are today, spiritually speaking. cause and reason do not overrule motivation and purpose. Berger. Nicene Christianity perhaps needs to posit a motive for creation, a motive for God creating rather than not. The suggestion is Dr. Charlton's, and I believe it draws attention to the gaping chasm present in what falls under the umbrella of classical/traditional/conventional Christianity. The reasons for creation in traditional Christianity expound upon causes and their related ontological considerations and remain eerily silent when it comes to explicating the motivations for those causes and reasons. Simply put, traditional Christianity was designed to render all questions about the motivation for creation obsolete. Traditional Christianity is hardwired against the audacity of supposing God has any motivations for creation at all. Creation is just something God does. He could not do otherwise. In this sense, traditional Christianity is happy to inform you about the whats and hows but adamantly avoids considerations of the whys of creation because it rejects the possibility of any why nots. The supposed whys it does offer, God displaying His glory, creating all the good that can be created, etc., are merely what and hows in disguise. Traditional Christianity offers no insights into potential motivations for creation because it is grounded in secondary thought. By its nature and limitations, secondary thought precludes all considerations of motivation because it can offer nothing more than causes and reasons, which inevitably all culminate in the one and only big eternal cause and reason. Asking for anything beyond that point is considered absurd. Secular materialism is also grounded in secondary thought. Like traditional Christianity, it offers its own explanations of causes and reasons, and like traditional Christianity, it essentially rules out the possibility of comprehending any sort of underlying motivation for the physical universe. Secular materialism can tell you all about the Big Bang but will scornfully smirk at you if you dare ask it why the Big Bang occurred. The Big Bang, or string theory, or multiverse, or quantum this or that, is the only big cause or reason. Asking for anything beyond that point is absurd. In the end, traditional Christianity and secular materialism offer remarkably similar non-answers when it comes to the matter of why or positing motives for creation. Neither acknowledges the question as a valid question. And how could it be otherwise? After all, both are firmly grounded in secondary thought. Both implicitly deny the reality of direct knowledge and primary thinking. However, denials of reality do not negate reality. Primary thinking and direct knowledge are real, and it is through them, and only through them that we can access the whys, the motives for God creating rather than not. Note added, by extension, primary thinking and direct knowledge is the direction Christianity or, at the very least, individual Christians need to go. Traditional Christianity is like a dethroned boxing champion. Berger. Like a dethroned boxing champion, traditional Christianity just wants to get its belt back. What's the belt? Secondary thought. More specifically, the narrative. Traditional Christianity insists it will set the world right again when it regains its belt and rules the world via its system of secondary thought. So it trains really hard in secondary thought, but it is aged, flabby, and past its prime. That the current reigning boxing champ is a young, raging steroid monkey who fights only in rigged matches arranged and judged by complicit conventional, everyday system Christianity doesn't help the cause of traditional Christianity at all. But all of that is besides the point because it overlooks the fact that the narrative belt, the grand prize of all secondary thinking, is not worth having anymore. The narrative never was and never will be reality. The real grand prize is elsewhere, in a different sport altogether. The god of fear, who demands sacrifice, propitiation, worship, obedience, actually implies a good and loving Creator God. Bruce Charlton. There is that within human beings which believes in a God of fear, a God who, in some sense rules the human world, and who demands sacrifice, propitiation, worship and absolute obedience. I mean that God who is a characteristic underpinning and default of much monotheism, including that of many Christians of many kinds, throughout history. Because this is indeed a God of fear, people are afraid to give up their habitual attitude of sacrifice, propitiation, worship, obedience. Such fear as the ruling passion is very evident when interacting with many Christians, whatever lip service they pay to God being our loving Father. Such Christians do not really trust God, because they are afraid of God, and they are afraid of God because their mental image of God, their understanding of God, is of an all-powerful, all-knowing, yet incomprehensible and ultimately alien entity. As I said, this image of a God of fear seems natural and instinctive to humans, but, despite nearly 2,000 years of confusion and conflation, this image is not the Christian Creator God as revealed by Jesus Christ. The God revealed by Jesus does not demand sacrifice, propitiation, worship, or obedience, but instead love, or rather, Christ's God does not demand love, but is the God for those who recognize His love, and who love Him, and fellow men. Such is the revelation, yet we need not depend on revelation to know the good and loving Christian God, because this loving Creator God is implied by reality. For there to be creation, there must be love. If you really think about it, only a loving God would create. And we, you and me, as individuals, could only know this, if that loving God loved us, you and me, as individuals. To put it the other way around, the God of fear is a real God, which is why He is universally recognized and responded to. But He is not the Creator God, He is not the primary God. The primary God, call Him God, must be the Creator, and the Creator must be loving, else He would not create, and must love us as individuals, else we could not know anything. The God of fear is a secondary God, one who hates creation, who uses creation for self-gratification instead of love, who inverts creation against itself. Therefore the reality of that God of fear implies the God of love as primary creator. But this argument that the God of fear implies that the God of love is creator is not a logical entailment, it is an argument about persons. To accept my argument entails that we already, personally, value love above all. If we do not already value love as primary, as our highest aspiration, then we can just as easily accept the inversions of the God of fear. So, you can see how much of being a Christian hinges upon the fact that God is not incomprehensible. Knowing about God is not the same as knowing God, just as knowing about some human being is not the same as knowing Him. Or, properly expressed, how vital it is to being Christian that we each know God, and know God as we might know other people such as close family or a deep friend, experiential knowing of an individual. Unless we know God we cannot love God, and this means we must be capable of such love. And if we do know God, when we are knowing God, we know His love for us, and ours for Him, and then we will not fear Him. Although, in this mortal life we cannot always be in this state of knowing, nor even most of the time, and then we must be faithful to our memory of knowing. Thus the need for faith. Note added, to clarify. If God is allowed, by metaphysical assumption, to be incomprehensible, and if it is allowed for us to assume that God had no personal motivation for creation, because God is assumed to be an entity without passions, an entity that therefore cannot be motivated, then the reality of a God of fear doesn't imply a primary loving creator God. In other words, if the creator God is assumed to be incomprehensible in his motivations, then we cannot exclude that the God of fear is the primary God. This is why those Christians whose faith is shaped by a core belief in God's incomprehensibility, posit a God whose characteristics seem to be essentially the same as those of God as understood and described by the pure monotheisms. The uncreated freedom inherent in uncaused created beings. Francis Berger. I have always struggled to accept the way traditional theology defines and explains freedom within creation. Note, freedom does not exist out with creation except in the case of God, and could never get over the hump of created freedom being false and somehow unfree. My intuition informed me that authentic freedom could not be created by God or anyone. Nor could it simply be an inherent part of God creating actual beings. Real freedom had to be, well, free. It does not originate from some external source and exists entirely independent of contingency or necessity. In a nutshell, I concluded that freedom must be uncreated to be true. An unorthodox position if there ever was one. Fortunately, I eventually encountered the works of Nicholas Berdyaev and, to my surprise and relief, discovered that I was not the only person in the history of the world to hold to the unorthodox assumption of uncreated freedom. Berdyaev argued for the ultimacy of freedom, to the point that his vision of reality places freedom before being. Berdyaev's views on uncreated freedom stemmed primarily from the mystic Jacob Boehme, who envisioned the existence of something called the unground or ground without ground, a primordial void of consciousness and spirit from which God creates all being. Berdyaev took Boehme's unground a step further and placed it outside of God. Now the unground was not merely something from which God created but also something from which God emerged, pulling all of creation with him. Berdyaev's rationalization of placing the unground outside of God is triple-pronged: to explain the presence of an uncreated attribute man and God share, to define and protect freedom as authentic freedom against the limited doctrine of free will, and to absolve God from the existence of evil within creation. Berdyaev outlines his thinking succinctly in The Destiny of Man.
Out of the divine nothing, or of the ungrund, the Holy Trinity, God the Creator is born. From this point of view, it may be said that freedom is not created by God, it is rooted in the nothing, in the ungrund from all eternity. The opposition between God the Creator and freedom is secondary. In the primeval mystery of the divine nothing, this opposition is transcended, for both God and freedom are manifested out of the ungrund. God the Creator cannot be responsible for freedom which gave rise to evil. Man is the child of God and the child of freedom, of nothing, of non-being, Greek equivalent. Meonic freedom consented to God's act of creation, non-being freely accepted being. God the Creator is all-powerful over being, over the created world, but he has no power over non-being, over the uncreated freedom. The myth of the fall tells of this powerlessness of the Creator to avert the evil resulting from freedom which he has not created.
For the sake of clarity, it is worth noting that creation from the ungrund, as Berdyaev conceptualizes it, is not merely a reinterpretation of creatio ex nihilo, because the meonic freedom inherent in the ungrund is not no thing. It contains something God did not create, freedom, and that freedom unavoidably seeps into creation via God's act of creating, hence, Berdyaev's declaration that God is master over all being but not the uncreated freedom that is innately within the beings he creates. Uncreated freedom is also an attribute God shares with all other beings, dispelling the strict insistence on classifying and regarding God as a different category of being altogether. As far as theodicy goes, I find Berdyaev's explanation of evil far more convincing than traditional theodicean justifications, more convincing because it places the existence of evil beyond God's powers of creating, absolving God of the presence of evil and protecting traditional tenets of God's omnibenevolence. At the same time, by placing the ungrund outside of God, Berdyaev tramples ever so lightly on other traditional assertions of God as omniscient and omnipotent. In any case, glad to no longer be adrift alone upon what seemed like an endless ocean, I adopted Berdyaev's views on uncreated freedom for a few years. Nevertheless, I could not shake the intuition that his conceptualization of uncreated freedom contained many loose ends and gaps. For starters, I could not wrap my head around the idea of freedom preceding being, at least not in the fundamental sense as implied by God's self-emergence and simultaneous act of creation. Yes, the will to be must precede the being, but the will to be had to be rooted in something, otherwise it remains a case of mere potential actualizing into being. I also struggled to understand how the Trinitarian Godhead emerged from the ungrund, already distinct yet unified in eternal purpose, ready to create from the get-go. As of now, I have settled on Badiaf's conceptualization of freedom as uncreated as true but within the framework of already existing beings in the form of consciousness and spirit. In this sense, Burma's ungrund is more than a bubbling cauldron of mere potential and becomes a place of chaotic, unrealized potential. In my mind, God's forming and organizing of this unrealized potential from chaos into creation offers far more penetrating and coherent explanations for the motives of why God created in the first place while still maintaining the uncreatedness of freedom already inherent within beings, pre-existing, temporally eternal consciousness and spirit. It also underscores the virtually indescribably significance of freedom within creation, specifically, the honing of uncreated freedom toward love. Whatever happened to Poland? 1980s poster child of a resurgent Roman Catholic Church. Bruce Charlton. Just an observation. Those who can remember the 1980s might also recall that Poland seemed, very obviously, the poster child for the courage, vigor, relevance and positive qualities of the Roman Catholic Church. This was the era when there was a popular Polish pope, active against communism, and involved spiritually with Lech Walesa, and the explicitly Christian, and very trendy, solidarity movement within Poland. Then came the collapse of the Soviet bloc from 1989, and I think most people assumed that Poland would go on to exemplify a tremendous and lasting resurgence of Roman Catholic Christianity. It didn't happen, and instead Poland became thoroughly Western-orientated, secularized, leftist, and a mass exporter of its most active young people as economic migrants. Indeed, most recently, the Polish establishment has become actively determined to engineer national annihilation as the disposable tool of an evil cause, apparently determined to model the fate of Poland on that of its depopulated and nearly destroyed southern neighbor. What a turnaround in the space of just 3 decades. From a distinctive and life-embracing Catholicism, all around to mainstream Western self-loathing, suicidal atheist leftism. By contrast, the Eastern Bloc communist nations that had been historically Eastern Orthodox, experienced a massive, and still lasting, at least in the case of the Fire Nation, emergence and growth of their national churches, and of Christian influence. Secularism and leftism was significantly held back, and indeed rolled back to some extent. What are the lessons of such contrasting trajectories? Well, there are too many interacting aspects to pick on any particular one. But for Western Roman Catholics in particular, such a reversal is something deserving of honest, serious consideration. Fear induces spiritual retardation. Francis Berger. I refer primarily to the actual definition of the word retardation, a slowness in learning that induces problems in development, leading to hindered growth, although my use of the word is also somewhat pejorative as it also conveys my overall disapproval of those who promote fear as a spiritual virtue. Promoting fear as virtue lies in the injunction to serve God in fear and rejoice in trembling. How this squares up with Jesus' teaching of God, particularly in the 4th Gospel, is a bit of a mystery to me. Of course, it's no secret that organized Christianity has and, to some degree still does, employ the injunction to fear as a motivational tool to keep the pews and coffers full, but that is not the issue I want to focus on here. Many put a positive spin on the notion of fearing God by claiming the fear is rooted in the anxiety of unintentionally turning away from the divine. Others cite the word fear as a mistranslation and suggest the word is closer to something like reverence, devotion, or worship. Either way, I posit that the injunction to fear God and regard such fear as a spiritual virtue is woefully misguided. As Dr. Charlton recently pointed out, the Christian God is not a God of fear but a God of love, and when Christians think about God, they should be doing so from the perspective of love rather than fear. Why? Fear is a poison that inhibits, impedes, and thwarts all spiritual thinking and activity. This includes all fear, not just the fear of God. People gripped by fear immediately surrender their spiritual center and grounding to the external world, which is governed by fear. Human civilization is founded upon fear. All governments and organizations utilize fear, as do all marketers, advertisers, and propagandists. The sad truth of human society and the individuals who comprise it is that nothing in the world, entices, persuades, influences, sells, controls, manipulates, or commands as effectively as fear. Whenever we allow fear to influence and govern us, we alienate ourselves from our spiritual core and disrupt and obstruct our spiritual awareness and learning. At the most fundamental level, fear is an enslaving force. It strips away all sense of spiritual freedom, and renders one vulnerable to impositions and demands of external forces. One needs to look no further than the events of 2019 to 2022 to recognize the spiritual devastation and havoc fear can wreak on individuals and society. What we were all privy to during those years was fear-induced spiritual retardation on a grand, dare I say, epic scale. Far from being a virtue, fear is a sin that must be repented rather than embraced. Fear slices through freedom, and restrains the capability of love. Far from aligning with God, an individual gripped by fear, any fear, is an individual misaligned with God and the divine purposes of creation. But I have noted that fear is never a good counselor and went as far as to cite victory over fear as the first spiritual duty of man. Victory over fear can only be achieved through freedom and love. One cannot love if one is not free, and one is not free if one cannot love. Thus, fear must be faced and overcome. And if it cannot be overcome, it must be repented, for that alone counts as spiritual victory to a great degree. Perfect love casts out fear. Unfortunately, the converse is also true. Perfect fear casts out love. Mortal life, however, is about orientation and alignment, not perfection. Thus, we should aim for perfect love and eschew perfect fear. And those who preach fear and trembling should consider making the switch to love and repenting. Understanding the spiritual corruption that is fear. Bruce Charlton. I have written a good deal, over the past years, on the subject of fear as a sin. Some commenters have reacted immediately against this idea, pouring scorn on the idea, yet without, it seems to me, properly trying to understand the argument. That fear is a sin was not immediately obvious to me. I needed to think the matter through before becoming convinced. Francis Berger has added to the spiritual discussion of fear in a post today, taking a new angle and making several important points that had not occurred to me. Considering that fear is a besetting sin of the modern West, such that public expressions of existential terror in relation to a variety of socially approved subjects are not just acceptable, but attract positive moral approbation, I strongly recommend reading the whole thing and thinking about it. Fuzziness about assumptions and aims used to be okay, but now Christians need to be clear. Bruce Charlton. This is a thing that I assume, but not the kind of thing that can be proven. It is that in the past it was okay for Christians to have all kinds of wrong ideas, but now there are some particular core aspects of Christianity that it is necessary to become clear about. I regard this as a consequence of the development of a distinctively hard-edged modern consciousness. Whereas in the past, consciousness was more groupish, hence less personal, there was an inevitable fuzziness about concepts and aims because each individual's awareness was significantly subordinated to the groups in which he participated, his church, his clan, his nation. Much of Christian life was a matter of, often unconsciously, going along with group practices. Now, as I understand it, we just are primarily autonomous and isolated consciousnesses. Some people can, temporarily and usually partially, re-immerse in a group mind, but only by some kind of temporary depression of consciousness, such as intoxication, trance states, getting carried away by some crowd event, which might include a religious ceremony. Or people blitz their own consciousness, with constant and distracting sensory inputs from social and mass media. But most of the time we are awake and aware, we experience consciousness as isolated, alienated from the world, and ourselves. This being fundamentally on our own is, I think, why we now need to be clear about the truth of things, and about our purposes in living. This is why, when we are wrong about essential matters, it seems to make a much greater difference than it used to. Apparently, we cannot help but follow through our own ideas to conclusions and outcomes that necessarily affect us. Errors will lead to further errors, lies and other forms of untruthfulness will propagate into consequences. There is, in a loose but necessary sense, a karma of our choices. That, at least, is how I see it. And it is a very different business from the old theocratic way of defining a single permissible truth and way of living, and enforcing this upon the population at large. Now, the process of assumptions and consequences plays itself out in a multitude of individual consciousnesses. Whereas in the past Christianity was a matter of externally mediated and inflicted threats and rewards, nowadays the game of consequences happens inside each person, and operates with a kind of determinism. In the past each group-immersed person was not fully responsible for his spiritual convictions, therefore neither was he fully responsible for the consequences, but now that responsibility is unavoidable. Blue and Gold. William Wildblood. Meditate on blue and gold, as this will purify the mind and take it to a higher level where evil influences cannot operate. Anyone on the spiritual path will be attacked by evil, and the more progress you make, the more you will be attacked, or, using the word the masters who spoke to me back in the day used, assailed. Incidentally, they had a slightly old-fashioned way of speaking which, if adopted self-consciously, would just sound pompous, but if used naturally, as it was, gave what was said more weight. How are you attacked? There are generally two forms, external and internal. The former means you might come into contact with people who abuse you. The intention here, not so much of these people for they are merely pawns but of the dark powers behind them, is to get you to react and respond in kind, thus falling down to their level. Resist not evil doesn't mean don't fight evil. It means don't react to it or repay it in its own coin. The second way of attack is that the evil powers stimulate weaknesses within yourself, anger, pride, whatever it may be. They can do this but only if you permit them. They can affect your thoughts and emotions if you let down your inner guard and allow yourself to be carried away by the negativity they seek to stir up within you. They can only stimulate what is already there. Unto the pure all things are pure, but if you have a tendency to any particular sin they can blow on the coals, as it were, of that sin and cause it to flare up. If you are not watchful you might identify with this and be swept away by it. Therefore, stand back from your emotions, do not follow negative thoughts. Observe the pattern and disengage from it. If or when this becomes too hard and you find yourself unable to detach yourself from a particular bad thought or negative emotion, then the exercise at the beginning of this post can help. There is something about the combination of the colors of blue and gold that purifies and elevates the mind and, in the Master's words, takes it to a level where evil cannot operate. Evil can only function on the lower levels of being. As you rise through the planes, the shadows fall away and the light shines unimpeded. Blue and gold, which, not coincidentally, are the colors of the sun in a clear sky, have the effect, when concentrated on, of taking the mind to a higher place. Try it and see. If the system of totalitarian materialism in the West collapses into chaos, it does provide the potential, but only the potential, for a resurgence of individual, innate spirituality. Bruce Charlton. It is my impression that, after the recent US election, many who oppose the secular left totalitarianism have gone somewhat crazy with a kind of desperate but misguided optimism. They believe that things have turned a corner, because the public have discovered a new and positive motivation for a better society. But, I think what we are instead witnessing is an acceleration of the inevitable self-destruction of the attempt to create a global system of satanically directed self-chosen damnation, via omni-surveillance and micro-control in a context of societal materialism. This is a decline, not a rebirth. In a nutshell, the intent of the dominant evil faction in the establishment was to regulate the material world, perceptual inputs and concepts, in a public sphere which only recognized material reality, excluding all assumptions of God, divine creation, and the realm of the spiritual. The plan was, when people were convinced that only the material counts as real, and the material realm was captured by a totalitarian system, then people could be made to think almost anything, paving the way for that value inversion that would lead to the evaluation of evil as good, and a positive embrace of damnation and hell. But evil feeds upon itself, and is fissile by nature. Complex strategic plans will break down when the actors tasked to implement them instead increasingly pursue selfish and short-termist goals. So even as the system reached its zenith in early 2020, coming into the open with their intentions about the Great Reset and Agenda 2030, it was already demonstrating evidence of being subverted and taken over by the agents of chaos, with the collapse of control, evident from the anti-racist mania of summer 2020. This has continued, until more and more people have begun to notice. The totalitarian bureaucrats are beginning to panic. So the currently visibly accelerating collapse of the system is mostly motivated by evil, by spiteful selfishness and the desire for destruction, therefore not by a resurgence of mass goodness, and this change is not therefore, of itself, a cause for celebration. Except that the removal of the system does remove a powerful and adverse influence. Yet this is only a double negative. The collapse of lawful evil due to even greater but chaotic evil, does not amount to an increase in actual good. Therefore, it seems that the system of evil will not, at least in the West, be replaced by a system dedicated to good, and instead a social collapse into greater physical hardship and suffering seems very likely. However, this collapse does make space for individuals to break free from the manipulative enchantments of the system, and enables a greater possibility that less systematically oppressed individuals may choose to recognize and endorse whatever of innate and intuitive goodness lies within them. So greater hope is, as always, reasonable, so long as we are hoping for the right kind of things, which things are not of this world, at least not primarily nor directly. Hope for this world will happen, if it does happen, only after we are become next worldly.